Welcome, everybody. We are so delighted that all of you are joining. I know that people are coming into the room right now, and I am delighted to be here with you. My name is Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. I'm the president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance, and I have the privilege of working with many of you on this call. And also welcoming those of you who are maybe just joining us for the first time. Interfaith Alliance has been around for 30 years, and we have been, since that time, really working to make sure that America is here for everyone, especially no matter what religious tradition you come from, or if you don't come from any religious tradition at all, that you are treated equally in this country. That is our mission. We want to welcome everyone here today. This is an exceedingly important discussion for our moment in history. We are really living in very, very difficult, challenging times. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that what we are experiencing, both at the national level and at local levels where many of you work, live, lead, this is not a normal time, but it is the time that we've been given. And so I am really aware of how much this is taking out of each of us. And I'm here to say, take care of yourself and take care of those whom you love. And as you are able, I want to urge you to join together with friends, with families, with colleagues, with your community, and show up. This is the time we need to show up. If you know, there's that saying, like, what would I have done if I had been around at the civil rights movement? What would I have done if I had been around at other moments of authoritarianism, other times in our country? What would I have done? This is the time to find out, to really think about who you are in this moment. Interfaith Alliance is here to work with you, to be a resource for you, and hopefully a location, one of many in your life, where you can find help, where you can find a community, and also where you can plug in to make a difference. So today I am delighted to welcome you to one of those moments where we're really trying to offer people a resource. Information is power, and we are going to leave this hour more powerful than when we came. And part of the reason we're going to do that is our collective wisdom. But even, before that, we are going to be led in a really important discussion about Christian nationalism. So much of what is going on right now needs to be understood through the lens of what role religion is playing in this rise of authoritarianism in America. We have one of the best people in the country to bring us wisdom and perspective on what's happening right now. And so I am delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Brekus to Interfaith Alliance, to all of this conversation. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Dr. Brekus, and then we're just going to let her take it away for about 25, 30 minutes, give us a broad understanding of did this come from? Where has it manifested over the last, 300 years in our nation's history, even before we were a nation? What does it look like today, and where might it be going? But even alongside that, what have powerful people and communities done in response that has made a difference? And so we're going to get to those questions. We want to encourage you to ask questions using the question and answer chat that is at the bottom of your screen. So I am going to go into right now the introduction of Dr. Brekus. Dr. Catherine Brekus is the Charles Warren Professor of the History of Religion in America and chair of the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University. She is a leading scholar whose research focuses on the relationship between religion and American culture, with a particular emphasis on the history of women, Gender, Christianity, and the Evangelical Movement. Currently, she is writing a book about the relationship between American nationalism and Christianity and co-authoring a biography on Sarah Edwards. We're going to have you back to talk about that biography. But please, as you're listening, use the Q&A function. And Dr. Brekus, thank you so much for joining us. And we are all looking forward so much to hearing your wisdom today.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here with all of you and to speak about this topic, which I know is of concern to so many people. So I am going to share my screen because I have some images to show along with my talk today. What I'd like to do today, because we don't have a lot of time, I teach a whole course about religion and nationalism, and we do this in 12 weeks, twice a week. So in about a half an hour, I'd like to just raise some questions and then try to give you some very brief answers, and we can talk more in the Q&A. So these are the questions I want to ask here on the screen. What is Christian nationalism? I've included here an image that has really haunted me from the January 6th insurrection, where even as a historian of American religion, I was shocked to see the crosses in the crowd and the invocations of Jesus. And the more I thought about it, of course, the more I realized that given this sort of work that I do, that I shouldn't have been surprised. But I want first to be clear about what is Christian nationalism, and then in particular, what is white Christian nationalism, which is the subject of our conversation today. I want to ask, why has white Christian nationalism surged in recent years? As we're going to see, it's not new, but it is certainly resurging. I'm also going to ask how Americans in the past have fought against white Christian nationalism. I think people today feel as if they're the first to really confront this, and in fact, there's a long history of protest. And then finally, I'll ask, what can we do today to respond to the resurgence of white Christian nationalism? Let me first just be clear about what I mean by the term Christian nationalism. It has often gotten used today, I think, in ways that suggest that it's synonymous with conservative Christianity. I have a more specific definition of Christian nationalism. I define it as the belief that first, the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and second, that the nation itself is sacred and has a redemptive role to play in human history. So I think it's important to recognize that Christian nationalism is not new. It goes back to the very founding of the Republic, and in fact, it has roots even in the 17th century, which I won't talk about today, although I'd be happy to answer questions about it. But the point is that Christian nationalism has deep roots in American history that stretch all the way back to the Revolutionary period. So here we have an 18th century sermon, 1777, from Nicholas Street, who was a Congregationalist minister in Massachusetts, who preached a sermon entitled "The American States Acting Over the Part of the Children of Israel in the Wilderness." This is only one example of many sermons that portrayed the United States as the fulfillment of the promises made in the Hebrew Bible. In this sermon, Street described King George III as Pharaoh and suggested that the colonists were like the oppressed Israelites. Street explained to his congregation, "The British tyrant is only acting over the same wicked and cruel part that Pharaoh, king of Egypt, acted towards the children of Israel above 3,000 years ago. Many historians have argued that in the 18th century, one of the models for the nation state was, in fact, the Hebrew Bible. And many revolutionary patriots argued that God had made a covenant with the United States in the same way that God had made a covenant with Israel. They described the United States as a new Israel, a redeemer nation that had been specially chosen by God. This is why I'm writing a book called Chosen Nation, because it really, the book is about the way that the United States has always had this identity as being on a special mission from God. So these ideas about America as a new Israel were widespread. In 1774, when Congress considered creating a new seal for the United States, Benjamin Franklin, of all people, he was a skeptic in many ways, suggested that the seal should be, and I'm quoting from him, an image of, quote, Moses lifting up his wand and dividing the Red Sea, and Pharaoh in his chariot overwhelmed with waters. He wanted the seal to include the motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. I think it's fascinating that Franklin proposed this because he probably is best described as a deist. He had questions about the divinity of Jesus. But Christianity was an important source of meaning in the 18th century, even for people who were not regular churchgoers. Many people learned how to read by reading the King James Version of the Bible. And it seems clear that Franklin was drawing on the Hebrew Bible when he was thinking about the identity of the nation. So here's one of my absolute favorite images from the early 19th century. Here we can see that the religious meaning that many Americans ascribe to the nation was very popular. So here we have John James Barrett's painting The Apotheosis of Washington. If you remember your Greek mythology from school, an apotheosis is the transformation of a human being into a god. And here we see George Washington as a Christ-like figure being raised from the tomb. This is really an extraordinary image. Washington is cruciform, like Jesus. There are many scholars who write about civil religion and point to something like this, but I think we can see that civil religion has sort of Christian components. This image, I think, is only recognizable to people who know something about Christianity. Many Americans during the Revolutionary period and beyond fused their faith in the nation with their faith in Christianity. And they imagine the nation's leaders, especially Washington, and the nation itself as having a sacred purpose. The nation was imagined as redemptive. So there is no doubt that many Americans interpreted the revolution through a Christian lens. But I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting here that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. The Constitution itself never mentions Christianity, and the only mention of God in the Constitution at all is in Article 7, when the signers affixed their signatures to the document, quote, in the year of our Lord, 1787, which is just the way people signed documents. But it is clear that at the time of the founding and in the years after the founding, especially after the revivals known as the Second Great Awakening, there were some Christian Americans who rued the absence of God in the Constitution. They thought it had been a mistake. And during the Civil War, there were some Northern Christians who thought that the war should be understood as God's punishment on the nation for its failure to recognize God's sovereignty and the Constitution. So here we see the Constitution of the Confederate States that was drawn up in 1861. The preamble is identical to the preamble of the United States Constitution. But as you can see in the words that I've bolded, the Confederates decided to explicitly recognize God. Um, uh, Southerners also claimed that the Bible sanctioned African slavery and that God Himself was sanctioning slavery. So this brings me to my second question about what is white Christian nationalism in particular. And here I want to go back to the proposed seal for the United States. Not all varieties of Christian nationalism have privileged whiteness. But since our topic today is white Christian nationalism, I want to make it clear that there's a subset of these kinds of ideas in which Americans argued that God had destined the United States to not only to be a Christian nation, but to be a white nation. So returning to Franklin's seal, he not only claimed that America should be understood as a new Israel, but he identified white patriots with the enslaved Israelites, ignoring the fact that white patriots were, in fact, in many cases, slaveholders. So he erased the presence of the enslaved in this seal. When we look at Jefferson's proposed seal with Hengist and Horsa, I think the sort of implicit identification of America with whiteness is even more clear. Um, Jefferson wanted the seal to have Moses on one side and then to have Hengist and Horsa on the other. So John Adams said he wanted Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Um, During the 16th and 17th centuries, Anglo-Saxons were often celebrated as the founders of British liberty. And they were usually depicted, as you can see here, as white warriors. In the 19th century, the term Anglo-Saxon was increasingly identified with white supremacy. So here we can see how Jefferson had a sort of implicit understanding of the Republic as being a republic of white men. I want to point out that in this seal, we do in fact have two men looking somewhat muscular, and white Christian nationalism has always been intertwined with the idea of women's political subordination. And I can say more about that in the Q&A. So the belief that God had destined the nation to be a white nation only increased during the 19th century. During the 1830s and 1840s, many Americans claimed that the United States had been given a manifest destiny to expand westward. The term manifest destiny was coined in 1839 by the journalist John O'Sullivan, who argued that, quote, our manifest destiny is to possess the whole of the continent. When I have taught this piece before, my students are always amazed when they read O'Sullivan suggesting that both Canada and Mexico would be annexed by the United States. This was before this political administration, where this no longer seems so amusing. But you can see in this painting by John Gast that we have this woman who represents Columbia. We can tell she's Columbia by the star on her head. She has the telegraph wire in her hand, one hand, and a school book in the other. She is bringing the train with her. She is bringing farming and white settlers. And I hope you can notice that in the corner of the painting, we have Native Americans who are fleeing into the darkness, away from progress. So that this is a sort of justification for Native American removal. The idea that God had destined the nation to be white and Christian led to a great deal of anti-immigrant sentiment in the late 19th century. This is actually a soap ad from 1892, a soap called Magic Washer. And what we see here is Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese American man out. He is, depicted as being dirty and un-American. This 1892 is actually 10 years after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And in 1924, the United States would pass the most restrictive immigration act in American history, the Johnson-Reed Act, which limited immigration or immigrants to 2% of the number of people from that country who are already living in the United States based on the 1890 census. So the effect of this was to place really sharp limitations on immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and it also completely excluded immigrants from East and South Asia. So, uh, so let me turn to my third question. Why is it that white Christian nationalism, which is certainly not new, as we can see here, why has it enjoyed a resurgence in recent years? And there are two things that I want to mention. This is a very complicated question. I think some of this has to do with economic changes. But on the most basic level, I want to point out first that there has really been a deep uneasiness about the loss of the once privileged place of white Christians in American civic culture. So here we can see a somewhat alarmist headline from the New York Daily News in 2019, tipping toward a white minority. And it is true that whites have been declining as a percentage of the population as a whole. In 1980, about 80% of the population identified as white, but by 2022, that percentage had dropped to about 60%. At the same time, there has been a decline in church membership and in institutional Christianity. I'm not so sure there's been a decline in religion overall, but certainly in membership in churches. So in the early 90s, roughly 90% of the population identified as Christian. But by 2022, that percentage had dropped to about 62%. And the result is that there are growing numbers of Americans who would like the United States to return to some mythical past in which it was a Christian nation. So here we see some statistics from the Pew Research Center from 2022, where you see that about 45% of their survey respondents said that the United States should be a Christian nation. I included this particular table because I think these other statistics about the Supreme Court and, should churches endorse political candidates, those percentages are smaller. So it does suggest that there's some larger anxiety about the politicization of Christianity. So, in the oh, sorry, here are some statistics about the decline of Christians from about 78% in 2007, and declining. The decline seems to be stalling right now. We're not entirely sure why. Some think that it has something to do with Donald Trump's popularity and the way that evangelicalism has now, for some people, become a political as well as a religious identity. It is easy to get discouraged thinking about the past and the prevalence of white Christian nationalism. But I do want to turn to my fourth question, which is, how have Americans in the past fought against white Christian nationalism? And I'm just going to give you two examples, but I could give you many. But here's one of my favorites. This is a slide of Phyllis Wheatley, who is, just one example of a long and inspiring history of Americans who invoked both Christian and American ideals to call for a more expansive understanding of the nation's identity. Wheatley was an enslaved woman, a poet. She was the first Black woman to be published in what would become the United States. She arrived in Boston as a child of 6 or 7 from Africa. Her name, Phyllis, came from the boat on which she arrived. But she turned out to be a very intelligent person who learned English very quickly and then began studying the classics under the guidance of the daughter of the family who had purchased her. In 1774, she condemned what she called the avarice and the hypocrisy of white patriots who ruthlessly practiced slavery while lamenting their own supposed enslavement by the British. In a letter to Samson Occam, who himself was an extraordinary person, he was a minister and a member of the Mohegan tribe. Wheatley reversed the meaning that patriots had ascribed to the book of Exodus by portraying enslaved and indigenous people as the true biblical Israelites and the Americans as their Egyptian oppressors. They were, in her words, modern Egyptians. This was a scathing indictment of white hypocrisy that was published, and which did in fact help to mobilize anti-slavery sentiment. I think one of the interesting things about Wheatley is that she herself, in her poetry, wrote in glowing terms about George Washington and American freedom. And she shared the assumption that God had intended the United States to serve as a beacon for the rest of the world. Where she differed from white patriots is she argued that the United States had been called up to be a beacon of racial equality, that America had not yet lived up to its promise of freedom, which she saw as not only a sort of Republican principle, but as a Christian principle. The same kind of argument was made by Martin Luther King. And here we have his letter from a Birmingham jail, and in which he argued that there is, in fact, a sort of American destiny, that the essential meaning of the United States is freedom, and that that God was on the side of those who were fighting for civil rights. Some of you might remember that the motto of the Southern Leadership Convention was to redeem the soul of America. So there are models of how Americans have fought against Christian nationalism in the past. And so I just want to end here by saying, what is it that people can do today to respond to the resurgence of white Christian nationalism? I think it's really important to recognize that white Christian nationalism isn't new. It has tended to wax and wane over the course of American history. But it's also true that generations of Americans before us have fought similar battles. If I had more time today, I would give you many more examples of the way that Christians, in particular, have countered the argument that the United States is supposed to be a white Christian nation governed by men. But just here are a few highlights. In the 19th century, American Christians argued against slavery, fought against Indian removal, advocated for people with disabilities, and defended women's right to vote. In the 20th century, they supported Native American citizenship, marched for the civil rights of African Americans, advocated for women's economic, religious, and political equality, and defended LGBTQ rights. So these are not small accomplishments, and the fight goes on, as you can see on the screen, with the many organizations. These are only some. These are organizations and people. Pope Francis is on here as well. There are many organizations who are holding sessions like the one that we are in the midst of today. There are many organizations that are actively trying to counter the worst features of white Christian nationalism on our landscape today. So I'm going to stop here so that we have plenty of time for questions.
Well, let me say thank you so much. That survey and that sense of longevity, and also just really pinpointing moments and getting specific about it. I just really appreciate it so much. Dr. Brekus, I'm going to take privilege of asking you an initial question, which is, can you point a time in US history where Christian nationalism had such a kind of collaboration in some ways with a tendency towards authoritarianism, or even maybe I mean, certainly there have been, you could even look at the time of Jim Crow and other times as perhaps examples of that. But right now we are in I would say it seems like a particular moment where the government is leaning into a Christian nationalist framework, legitimizing a lot of the work or the effort at dissembling our government, and using it as a shield and a weapon to kind of tamp down or deflect criticism. So I am curious, like, what's the relationship between Christian nationalism and authoritarianism? Even if there isn't a perfect analog from other times in our history, how do you see those two things playing out together?
I'm going to share my screen again so I can show you one image. Um, let's see if I can bring this up. Okay. So, here's a moment where I think it was a very dark period in the United States. This is an image from 1924. This is obviously an image of the Klan assembling. People are always surprised to learn that this image actually comes from California. This is not the Deep South. Um, uh, New members of the Klan would take their oath on a Bible that was covered by an American flag. Um, the Klan had a lot of power in the government. There were many Klan members who who were congresspeople, or there were congresspeople who were former members of the Klan. Hugo Black, the Supreme Court justice, had been a member of the Klan. I do think that we have obviously our situation right now is unique for many reasons, but I don't think it's unprecedented in the way that white Christian nationalists have tried to use state power to restrict the rights of others. In the case of the Klan, it was African Americans trying to prevent African American voting, for example. The Klan was also an anti-Catholic organization. Um, so, um, so I do think we have seen these moments of this sort of fusion between Christian nationalists and state power. And the way that Americans responded in the past was with this sort of local, well, both local and national mobilization. And in the case of the Klan, I think what was particularly effective was other white Christians arguing that the Klan did not speak for them. And I do think in our current moment, one lesson I would take from that in our current moment is that I do think that white Christians have a particular role to play, and a very important role to play at this moment. Throughout American history, there have been disagreements about, what is Christianity? What does it teach? What does it mean to be a Christian? And that fight seems particularly important today when I think white Christians need to say that white Christian nationalists are not speaking for them.
Mm, yeah, thank you for that. I think the other thing that, Interfaith Alliance and others are really noting forcibly into the public narrative is that this is actually one of the most anti-Christian administrations we've seen in years in the way they've attacked the Catholic bishops, the Lutherans, people like the Cooperative Baptists and the Friends, the Quakers. There's all sorts of ways that anyone who disagrees with them is against them, whether Christian or not, and it just kind of lays bare the hypocrisy of the entire, claim to be protecting Christians in America when you've been the most vocal and actually antagonized a bishop from her own pulpit for speaking to you about the gospel. Isn't,
And
how
she's
about
a
that?
wonderful example of, in her very calm way, asserting
Yeah,
what
I mean,
Christianity means to her.
and doing it in the most modest, sort of like, sympathetic way, and yet getting slammed and attacked and threatened. And so we have to make sure that part of what we do is not let them claim this mantle of Christianity. They can proclaim it, but they can't claim it, because we're not going to give that to them. I really appreciate. There's so many great questions, I have to say. That and aren't we lucky? We have a very engaged. I'm curious if let's see. Let me think about where do we want to start. I think one question I think from one of our list. Community, it says, are there examples of so-called Christian nationalists who eventually repented of what drove them to Christian nationalism over these years? Like, do we have stories of people saying, God, I mean, I wish I hadn't been caught up in that effort to do all of this work? I mean, it feels like a very good um, a very good question, because repentance is actually a pretty Christian idea. So, like, were there do examples come to mind?
I can't think of any sort of very high profile examples, but I could say that I have certainly read articles about people who uh, sort of um, didn't realize how hateful the path they were on actually was. But if I'm trying to think about, sort of major leaders that you would recognize, no one is coming to mind. But I do think that, this is a framework of thinking that is flexible. There are obviously some people who are not going to change their mind. But there is a sort of shared Christian language here, to go back to the point that I made before. So, so you can argue with people on Christian grounds and on
Hmm.
scriptural grounds about what it is that Christianity calls them to do.
Yeah. I'll share a brief story. So when Hugo Black was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he had to join the Klan. Um, my great grandfather was a Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. There was reporters descended on his summer home, and they wanted a comment, and he refused to give that. But Hugo Black went on actually to offer some quite progressive decisions on the court. And my guess is that
Yeah.
he had joined the Klan as kind of a civic thing, and then I think later disavowed some of the underlying ideas. Let's go to another question, which is why and how has such an obviously non-Christian person as Trump become the person they have decided to follow?
Yeah. I have to say, I think I was as surprised as anybody when Trump was elected the first time and evangelicals were flocking around him. I kept expecting the scales to drop from their eyes and for them to realize that the person they were supporting um, was not Christian. There certainly had been previous leaders like George W. Bush, I think, who or Mike Pence, who they recognized as really being part of their own tribe. My own explanation for this is that white Christians have, in fact, felt much less powerful in recent decades, and they have reason to feel that way. They are not making this up. Christianity has had a long privileged place in American culture. And what we've been seeing since the 1960s is really a sort of decline in Christian adherence, even with the rise of the Christian right, a decline in Christian adherence, and a change in the way people are practicing Christianity. For some people, this is really very threatening. What Trump has offered that former presidents did not was the willingness to really fight for them. So many evangelical Christians, on one hand, they really admire George W. Bush. But I remember during his administration, many evangelical Christians were really frustrated by him. They wanted him to declare the United States a Christian nation. They wanted him to do more to end abortion. Um, and they felt as if they were being taken for granted. That something like 80% of white evangelicals have been voting Republican since around the time of Ronald Reagan, and they didn't feel like they were getting much for it. And so, there have been efforts to suggest that, maybe Trump is like King Cyrus in the Bible. He's the unbeliever who actually, helps. He's going to help Christians triumph over unbelief. More recently, after the assassination attempt, there were some people who suggested he was, in fact, anointed by God. But really, I think the appeal is that he approaches things as a bully. And this is what evangelicals want. They feel disenfranchised and they want a bully to give them the same kind of power that they used to have. So,
Yeah,
on
I
one
think
hand, I want to be
he's
empathetic about what they are going through because the United States has changed. On the other hand, we are founded on principles of religious freedom. And no one religious group, no matter how powerful their past history, has the right to dictate to others.
yeah, and I think the use of bully is really interesting. There's a question here about gender and white Christian nationalism. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, we have Paula White in the White House, but in many of the leaders in the white Christian nationalist movement are men. Uh, how do you understand gender and Christian nationalism and how it plays into a lot of the way that white Christian nationalism is flexing in the White House today, and the way that, even just looking at the nominees, all of the cabinet appointees, how do you understand gender in this moment?
So I'm going to share my screen again because I want to go all the way back to the 18th century. I want to show you a cartoon. Let's see. Okay. So this is from 1775. This was actually a British cartoon, but it was widely circulated in America. And I think it shows you the sort of stereotype of political women. This is a society of patriotic ladies in North Carolina. They are signing a petition. There were many American women who are involved in petition campaigns. And if you look at this image, you can see we have, for those of you who are older like I am, and you remember the cone heads on Saturday Night Live, this woman over here looks like one of the cone heads. We have an abandoned child on the floor with a dog that's urinating on the floor. We have a woman who seems to be, sort of her ideas are being dictated by this man. We have an African American woman who is sort of trying to push herself into um, these deliberations. There seems to be some drinking going on in the background with a punch bowl. And I would say that, from the time of the founding forward, there has always been ambivalence about how much political power women should have, to the point where now, there are some members of the really sort of far right who are suggesting that women should not be allowed to vote. I do think that white Christian nationalism has always been intertwined with patriarchy, with a sense of not only white privilege and Christian privilege, but also male privilege. And that men are supposed to be, these are very old Christian ideas, right? That women are not supposed to be ordained, women are not supposed to preach, women are supposed to be subordinate. And these ideas have always had political valence, but continue to have political valence, even at a time when women have been, remarkably successful in finding their ways into high-paying careers and, of course, political power. I don't see this piece of it changing anytime soon, even though there are certain women who are sort of, they're exceptions. They're treated as exceptions, like a Paula White, as spokespeople for a more restrictive gender ideology.
Mm. Here's another really interesting, moving into the courts and the legal, and this, you know, you may not feel like you want to get into legal questions, but we have a good question. It says, historically, have the courts offered a moderating force to prevent Christian nationalism from taking too much of a stronghold in our schools, local governments, and communities? Should we be concerned about the apparent increase in judges at all levels who seem receptive to a weaker wall between church and state, or perhaps more free exercise and less establishment, non-establishment? Do Do you have are you able to opine on that?
I have been watching very carefully some of the cases that are going on right now where there has been an attempt to introduce the Bible into public schools on the grounds that it was important to American history. This to me seems a Trojan horse. I'm all in favor of teaching about religion in history courses. I am an American religious historian. But this sort of thing that they're imagining is they want the Ten Commandments posted on the bulletin board in a classroom. And this really does seem as if it's an attempt to bring back what really used to be a custom in the 19th century of Bible reading in public schools. And that really didn't end until around the 1960s. And there are people who've been fighting against it ever since. One of the ironies of all of this is that, many of the fights in the 19th century about Bible reading in public schools were fights between Protestants and Catholics about religious freedom. The Protestants were in the ascendance in the 19th century, and they wanted the King James Version of the Bible to be read in public schools. The King James Version of the Bible actually has a lot of sort of anti-Catholic translations in it. And so, what Catholics objected to in the 19th century was a reading of the Ten Commandments that included a second commandment that, you would not worship graven images, which was really aimed at Catholics. The irony now is, many Catholics in the 19th century actually created Catholic schools in order to avoid having their children read the Protestant version rather than the Catholic version of the Ten Commandments. Now we have Catholics who seem to have completely forgotten about that history.
Hmm.
And in Louisiana, the Ten Commandments that they want to post on the wall are actually the Ten Commandments from the movie, The Ten Commandments. And there are 12 of them. There are 12 of them because they were developed by a rabbi, a priest, and a minister in the creation of the film who decided on these 12. So what they're suggesting that they're going to put in classrooms is nobody's Ten Commandments. But there is a sense that somehow having some piece of the Bible in the classroom is going to reverse the slide of Christianity in American
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like one of those things as a parent and as a pastor, it mystifies me how religious folks say they want this in the schools, and yet like they're outsourcing religious instruction in a way. Like, they're kind of saying, okay, let's make sure that you see this. And then please don't ask a question about any of these 10 commandments and have someone you don't know who that is actually telling you what that means. And like all of this is, it seems so strange to me that the outsourcing of religion, and with you, I love the fact that my son can learn about all different religions in school. It's not that I don't, and that everybody feels free to be themselves, but I don't want one tradition to be exalted over another, and I don't want someone else telling them what those things mean.
Yeah.
I think that's one of our strongest arguments against it is how bad it is for faith and how bad it is for families. We have so many good questions. You have really like, wow, wow, wow. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to answer them all. I do want to tell everyone, thank you for these great questions. And I think there is an opportunity to continue to learn and grow. And my hope is that we'll have more opportunity for conversation. One that I want to end on with you is like, what is your hope for the next 4 years? What would you like this community to hear you say? What should we all be thinking about as ways to show up to counteract the terrible effects of white Christian nationalism on American today and the way it's supporting our slide towards authoritarianism?
Well, first of all, I'm just so grateful for this organization and all the other organizations, that I put up on that slide. And there, I could have kept going, and they all would have been tiny little miniature icons. But I think these kinds of organizations are crucially important. As I said before, I think Christians have a particular responsibility in this moment, but I think that people of all traditions or no tradition can also continue to assert the importance of our founding on principles of religious freedom. And so there's really a role to play for everybody here. And I would just say that, for people in the past, for a Phyllis Wheatley, for example, or for a Martin Luther King, or for anti-lynching activists in the 20th century, it seemed as if things would never change. But I do want to come back to, when you look at the polling data, most Americans are not Christian nationalists. And I think that there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. I don't want to minimize the seriousness of the moment that we're in, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of reason for hope.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to close with just offering a few of the resources that Interfaith Alliance has. You can go to our website and just explore. Would love to hear from you. You can find ways to contact us. Every week, I have conversations with leaders from many of the groups that Dr. Brekus mentioned, and other intellectuals. So I'd love for you to know about the state of belief, and learn about that. We just completed and released a really important white paper on Together Against Hate, which really identifies white Christian nationalism as the source and the destructive force, and bringing hate into our public life, and learn more about ways that people have fought back. We have case studies. It's a really great report, and I encourage you to look. We also have an executive order tracker if you're really looking at the ways that the administration is putting out all these different executive orders, and we try to say what it means, what it's trying to do, and also what you can do about it, and ways to counteract it. So that's important. We we want to highlight one specific, which is action item, or a few. One of them is the protect the right to vote and vote no on SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is a very detrimental act that's being introduced now that will disenfranchise millions of Americans. So please join us in that. Don't bring public school chaplains to my state is another one petition. We have affiliates around the country, and if you're not associated with affiliate, you can look around at our list of affiliates, and if you don't see one in your neighborhood, think about, should we have one in my state? Should we have one in my city? We would love to hear from you if you're interested in learning. And we also have an email with Adam Friedman, who is our lead organizer in that. And more broadly, I just want to say to each one of you how important it is, and I think Dr. Brekus really set us up well, is that there's no magic formula here. It's about people showing up. It's about people showing up, and in all different ways, and how we show up, and we represent both our country and also our religion, and insist that we will not allow other people to define it for us, and that we will show up. And, just one example, working with the American Library Association, which is getting, libraries and librarians are getting absolutely attacked by people claiming the religious mantle, Christian nationalists, claiming that they get to ban books, they get to decide. And what we put out is ban books, ban beliefs, which is about people of all faiths coming together and saying, no, we don't believe in banning books. So I just want us all to think about, what can we do to counteract white Christian nationalism in our time, just as brave people have shown up throughout history and counteracting it in the past. So one more time, join me in thanking Dr. Brekus and all of your amazing work over the years. Thank you so much for what you've done for the field, the scholarship, and also helping to inform groups like ours to do our work better. So we really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you. Good night.